Welcome to Canadian Justice. I'm Christine Van Gyn, and today we're talking about new revelations that the Canadian military saw the pandemic as a unique opportunity to test propaganda on the domestic Canadian population and developed a plan to test out these techniques. The Ottawa Citizen has been breaking stories on the military's use of propaganda on the domestic population in Canada, and this is the newest revelation. This information was included in a report that the Ottawa Citizen obtained through access to information legislation. The newly revealed propaganda plan relied on techniques similar to those used in the Afghanistan war. The group that developed the plan, the Canadian Joint Operations Command, claimed that this plan was needed to head off civil disobedience by Canadians during the pandemic and to bolster government messages. Here today to talk about the details of what was uncovered and what it all means are two experts. Emma Bryant is a British scholar and academic researcher on media propaganda, surveillance, and information warfare, and was involved in exposing the Facebook Cambridge Analytica data scandal. And Paul Robinson is a professor at the University of Ottawa and author of 6 books on political issues. Thank you both so much for joining me today. Professor Robinson, can you tell our viewers what were some of the specifics about this new plan that's been revealed?
Well, this was largely associated with assistance being given by the Canadian Forces to long-term care homes and the COVID crisis. There's a whole bunch of revelations come out involving essentially collecting data on groups who might be considered to be perhaps, discontented and so on. And this included, for instance, Black Lives Matter, for instance, as one of the groups on which information was collected. And what we've learned from the latest revelations is that, this wasn't just a few crazy people in the military at a low rank deciding to go off and do this on their own bat. But this was actually considered quite high up in the chain of command in the Canadian Joint Operations Command, as one of the rear admirals put it, as a unique opportunity to try out and experiment with essentially information warfare techniques. So this was endorsed quite high up.
So, Professor Bryant, is there anything you want to add to that? I know that one of the things the Citizen obtained was this report through access to information legislation. What were some of the details of what was in that report?
Well, I think the most interesting thing is actually how we have seen a development and experimentation at really high levels on how we evolve information operations in a digital age. These are, today's information wars are involving social media systems where you can bury and hide all sorts of kinds of activities. Data is central to contemporary operations in democracies and outside of democracies. And we're seeing what we're really seeing in this kind of plan is militaries not really having a set protocol on how to go about this. It is evolving as they go. And what we are, seeing is how unprepared they are for the landscape that we're in right now. And them experimenting on us, almost, I don't even want to use the word lab rats, but I'm concerned that there are rules that are not being followed anymore. It seems like the boundaries are being pushed.
So, Professor Robinson, one of the things that the report outlined was that some of these were techniques that were used and developed during the Afghan war, and then they were considering using this on the domestic population. What are some of those techniques, and how could they be applied domestically?
Well, I don't know the specifics of that, but a lot of this involves in modern sort of intelligence gathering and information warfare. It involves sort of quantitative data in which you amass large amounts of data on individuals and then try and develop patterns, understand patterns among them, from which you could then use to exploit in certain ways. So that's the kind of thing, as far as I understand, which is going on. But I think it's related, not just to Afghanistan, but I think it's related more broadly to these sort of general discussions which are going on nowadays about hybrid warfare and Russian and Chinese disinformation. And as a result of all these, we've become very, so I'd say, actually rather paranoid in regarding sort of the information sphere as no longer being, a private sphere for the media and so on, but actually as a sphere of war.
Paul, we've got to go to commercial break, but I'll let you finish right after that. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing recent revelations that the Canadian military planned to use propaganda on the domestic Canadian population. And Professor Robinson, I was asking you what some of those techniques might look like, and you were just going to finish what you were saying in the last segment.
Yes, what I was saying is there's been a lot of talk recently about hybrid warfare, information warfare, and so on. And the idea is developed essentially that this is a war being fought on our own soil, in which control of information is key, and in which information is essentially being securitized, and it's being talked about in terms of war, and therefore the military feels that it should be involved, and that it should have a role in shaping the information climate within Canada.
Now, Professor Bryan, what can you say about the legality of the military engaging or planning to engage in propaganda against Canadian citizens within our own country's territory? Is that even legal?
Within Canada, all of these kinds of operations would need to have legal approval. It's impossible to know how, whether these were run past legal counsel and what their advice was, because that would be protected. So there's no way we can gain access to that through, freedom of information legislation in Canada. However, this should have been legally approved. The fact that we are seeing from these reports that actually experimentation was taking place without higher approval raises questions around this. And I'm not going to, I don't know whether, I'm not a lawyer in Canada, so I can't say whether this was legal or not, but it should have had approval, especially things like targeting of the Black Lives Matter and so on. And the fact that this kind of data harvesting is taking place, Canada needs to be, the Canadian military needs to be transparent about that and explain to Canadian citizens why, saying there are threats that are targeting these groups and that is just not quite enough. You need to say how you're using data, why you're using data. Saying it's all like it's marketing is not good enough when militaries are capable of doing deception operations in different contexts, okay? Targeting, foreign audiences. Well, you've got foreign audiences in the domestic context. You are talking about foreign threats and the relationship between those actors and domestic groups. And you are not being very clear how you are treating Canadian citizens' data. Now, that's going to create concerns that actually end up fueling Russian propaganda, okay? This is the crazy mess that we've got into here, and why is that happening? It's happening because of failures of oversight, according to the reports that are coming out.
Yeah, I want to get into that oversight, but first I want to ask Professor Bryan his perspective on the legality of this, and then even legality aside, what about the ethics of the military engaging in propaganda against the domestic population?
Well, I'm not.
Sorry, that was Professor Robinson.
Yeah, well, I'm not a legal expert. My subject of study is military ethics rather than military law. So I'll answer the sort of second half of your question, which is to do with the ethics of it. I would say that there's severe ethical problems with this because the Canadian forces exist to serve the Canadian public, not to tell the Canadian public what to think. It's the Canadian public which decides, and the Canadian forces which enact. And it's not the job of Canadian forces to tell the Canadian public what it is they should decide. Therefore, manipulating public opinion is beyond the mandate of the Canadian Armed Forces and something which really they should not be involved in.
Now, Professor Bryant, we know that other countries engage in propaganda against their own citizens, but I think that most of us, when we think of that, we don't think of liberal democracies. We think of countries like Russia or China, not the NATO countries. But is this actually happening in liberal democracies?
Well, of course, countries like Canada, the United States, the UK, and European democracies, all these countries also are, communicating with their citizens. There are, ways that all governments need to be able to engage their citizens with public health campaigns and so on. What the military's role in this is, they need to obviously communicate why they are going into conflicts, why they are deploying the kinds of, solutions they are. They need to be able to tell us about the, forces that they are, our...
Professor Bryant, we've got to go to commercial, but I'm going to let you finish after. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing recent revelations that the Canadian military planned to use propaganda on the domestic Canadian population. And Professor Bryant, I had asked you about whether other liberal democracies are engaging in propaganda against their own population. I just wanted to give you an opportunity to finish your comments.
I wanted to just add that it depends on, I suppose, how you define propaganda. Like, all governments need to communicate to their citizens. All, militaries need to tell and explain to their citizens why they are deploying people into conflicts and how they're using particular technologies and so forth. And they are probably going to put this in a way that advances what they are doing and explains it in a way that justifies it. We also have important efforts to, communicate during things like coronavirus and so on, crises. We need to be able to guide our citizens towards behaviors that are, pro-social and helpful for society, pro-health, and so on. And the military sometimes get involved in that. But how they were going to get involved is incredibly important. And we don't want to be stepping over that line into coercive and manipulative kind of practices that they would be using for foreign audiences. So that brings us back to the question of what techniques were used in Afghanistan and what's acceptable and what's not. And this is a really important discussion that we need to be having around ethics and propaganda.
So, Professor Robinson, I'm glad that Professor Bryant brought up this public affairs issue, because the public affairs was actually implicated in one of the military public affairs was implicated in one of the earlier reports by the Citizen, which found that public affairs had launched a plan to allow public affairs officers to use propaganda to change attitudes and behaviors among Canadians, as well as collect and analyze information from public social media accounts. So what can you tell me about that earlier report and what that means in relation to what Professor Bryant had been talking about? Did that cross a line?
Well, I think you're beginning to, to some degree, that's a recognition of reality of what public relations is actually really all about. And in a sense, being rather more honest than what was previously said to be the case. But I think the idea that the Canadian forces and forces of democratic states have not been involved in manipulating public opinion for a very long time would be extremely naive, because, of course they do. And David Pugliese, who wrote this Revelations we've been talking about in the Ottawa Citizen, has also written about how the Canadian forces, and he's quite blunt about it, he says lied about the mission in Afghanistan and bent over backwards to try and persuade the Canadian public that everything was going swimmingly well when it wasn't. We've seen similar reports in the United States, where the United States official auditor, the Special Inspector General of Afghanistan Reconstruction, gave testimony to Congress in which he outright accused the US government of lying to the US people of the situation in Afghanistan. And we know of many other manipulative sort of propaganda techniques which are used by militaries. In America, for instance, huge subsidies are given to Hollywood whereby you get sort of free use of military resources if the Department of Defense happens to like the message which is in your movie, and there are vast links like this between the military structures and the media, Hollywood, TV, so on and so forth, all of which are designed to persuade the public to have a favorable attitude, both of the military and of whatever mission the military is being involved in. So, are Western liberal democracies involved in military propaganda? Yes, absolutely. They always have been and are very deeply involved.
Sometimes they do cross a line, though. So, Professor Bryant, there was this bizarre incident last year in Nova Scotia where military information operations sent around a fake letter warning about wolves and then even went into the woods with speakers to play wolf sounds. We've got about 30 seconds. Brief comment on that situation.
Well, I think the major takeaway there is that it seems to be a symptom of a wider breakdown of oversight and leadership and guidance and decent training, and just about everything. But I would say that it also is an illustration of the kinds of techniques that were taking place in Afghanistan and that never should be deployed in a domestic context. And I think there's this blurring and merging and bleeding because, governments and militaries are trying to experiment with new ways of going ahead.
We've got to go to commercial break, but we'll be right back. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing recent revelations around Canadian military how they plan to use propaganda on the domestic Canadian population in the COVID context. Professor Robinson, how do we find out if more of this has happened, and how do we get better oversight? I think one of the things that was concerning about these revelations was that there hadn't been higher level approval for a lot of this. So how do we get there?
That's a very good question, to which there is not an easy answer because of the very nature of the military beast, which is a beast which is concerned with issues of national security and as a result tends to operate behind a sort of wall of secrecy, right? So that very wall of secrecy means that it is, any time you inquire, you get told it's national security and so on and so forth. And this means that actually external accountability is almost impossible if we're going to be, very honest. We've attempted to have parliamentary committees to oversee defense and to oversee intelligence. They tend not to work very well, to be frank. So really, you have to rely on internal accountability, which therefore basically means the generals and the admirals who have to have a proper understanding of their place within the democratic sphere and to enforce it. Insofar as there's external accountability, the politicians have to make it clear to the generals and admirals where their place is. But that's really where it has to come from. But how do you get it? Well, that's quite difficult.
Professor Bryant, what are your thoughts on how we get better accountability from our military? I mean, there's not just a lack of accountability to our citizens, but there's lack of accountability to our elected leaders. How do we change that? Are there already steps that are being taken to change it? Where do we go?
I am delighted to jump in at this junction because this is exactly what I get most excited about. Is how important it is to enable this kind of work. You do not get that kind of accountability without people putting themselves on the line. What we need is whistleblowing. We need investment in research by academics, but also, civil society organizations into not just disinformation online, but the actors behind it, the influence firms. We are having this conversation because you were reporting on the fact that I exposed this important information about the parent company of Cambridge Analytica, the people coming on and setting up a new firm, working for the Canadian military, training public affairs officers. You need people to be doing that kind of work, digging, investigating, and you need amazing journalists like Dave Puglisi, who has, done incredibly brave work.
He's the journalist with The Citizen who broke a lot of these stories.
Yes, exactly. Working with researchers, working, with other journalists, digging and filing these transparency requests and forcing it out of the government and powerful actors. And we need this worldwide. And there are many efforts around the world in democracies to, attack people's rights to transparency. Ordinary citizens need to be pushing back against that. We need good funding to go to journalism and to the type of research that matters, not the Facebook funded research, okay? We need accountability research, and it's something that can be done, but it needs support because those people will be attacked. They will be, placed under great pressure. It's harder to do that kind of work than you think.
Well, I want to thank both of you for coming on and sharing your expertise today. Some of these stories really, really shocked me. The wolf one, pretty shocking, but I think it's a fair point that public relations and propaganda, sometimes there's a blurring of which is which. So thank you both so much for coming on today.
Thank you for
my pleasure.
We've heard today about some of the shocking conduct of Canada's military. The military's plans to exploit the pandemic and use wartime psychological tactics on a domestic population. Plans that the political leadership was unaware of and didn't direct. This is just the latest revelation in a line of troubling stories about military information operations directed at the civilian population. How can we get better oversight so this type of inappropriate, unethical, and potentially illegal conduct doesn't continue? What can politicians do to improve accountability in our military and better protect citizens from the people who are supposed to protect us? You be the judge. I'm Christine Van Gyn, and remember, a freer Canada starts with you.